Hello, good morning, students. Today, in this series of lectures, we are going to take up the next story entitled Some Words with a Mummy, penned by Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was an American writer, poet, editor, and literary critic. Poe is best known for his poetry and short stories, particularly his tales of mystery and the macabre. He is widely regarded as a central figure of Romanticism in the United States and of American literature as a whole, and he was one of the country's earliest practitioners of the short story. He is also generally considered the inventor of the detective fiction genre and is further credited with contributing to the emerging genre of science fiction. Poe was the first well known American writer to earn a living through writing alone, resulting in a financially difficult life and career. Poe was imaginative, romantic, loveless, and desperately needed affection. His foster father, Allan Poe, was unimaginative, realistic, practical, and unemotional. In utter disgust and frustration, Poe left his foster father's home and joined the army as a soldier. In 1829, his foster mother, who loved him very much, died and he returned home for a short stay. The present story, Some Words with a Mummy, begins with the narrator at home. He complains of feeling unwell due to a symposium he had attended the night before. After eating a light dinner of 4 pounds of Welsh rabbit and 5 bottles of brown stout, the narrator heads to bed or goes to bed. He is awakened shortly after he falls asleep by the ringing of his doorbell, followed by knocking at his door. Shortly after, his wife brings him a note from his friend Dr. Pononer. In the note, Dr. Pononer invites the narrator to his home to take part in a mummy unwrapping at 11 that night. Dear students, mummy, what is mummy? In Egyptian culture, mummy is the dead body of a person. So, mummy unwrapping at 11 that night, the narrator gets dressed and leaves for the doctor's home at once. Upon arriving at the doctor's home, he is met by an excited group of men waiting for the examination to begin. They begin by cutting into the first sarcophagus and removing it. At this point, they make their first discovery, the mummy's name, that is Allah Mistakio. Allah Mistakio. Mummy's name was Allah Mistakio. They then remove the second and third sarcophagi, revealing the body itself. Instead of finding the body wrapped in layer after layer of linen bandages, as they expected, the body was placed in a papyrus sheath and then covered in plaster and decorated with painting and gold gilt. After removing this, they examine the body. They find it to be in exceptionally good condition, although it does not seem to have been embalmed in the normal way, as the skin is red and there are no incisions or cuts. The narrator takes notice of the time as the doctor is laying out his instruments for the dissection, and the men agree to adjourn for the night as it is already past 2 in the morning. As the men begin to disperse for the night, one suggests experimenting with a voltaic pile. The excitement of using electricity on the body of a mummy dead for thousands of years proves too much of a temptation for the men, and they begin preparations at once. They make incisions or cuts into the mummy's temple, big toe, and nose in order to apply electricity to the muscles underneath the surface. When electricity was applied to the temple, the mummy closed its eyes. This disquieted the men, but the doctor continued. When it was applied to the toe, the mummy kicked the doctor with such force that he was thrown through the window. After collecting the doctor from outside, the men go back to work on the mummy. Electricity was applied to its nose. This caused the mummy to open its eyes and blink rapidly. It then sneezed, sat up, and shook its fist at the doctor. It then turned to two of the men, Glidden, Glidden and Buckingham, and began talking to them in Egyptian. The mummy condemned the men for their abuse of his person. Thoroughly chastised, the men make their apologies to Allah Mistakio and explain to him why they dissect mummies and the scientific importance of it. Satisfied with the explanation and their apologies, Allah Mistakio shakes hands with the men, who then proceed to patch up the damage caused by their incisions. They then gather up proper clothes for Allah Mistakio and sit down for cigars and wine. As the men talk, Allah Mistakio begins to explain how he came to be a mummy. Ancient Egyptians had a significantly longer lifespan than modern men, about 1000 years. They were also able to be embalmed. This process arrested the bodily functions, allowing them to sleep through hundreds of years only to rise and go on with their lives centuries later. Allah mistake you again chastises the men for their ignorance of Egyptian history. He then explains that throughout time, man has always been monotheistic. The pagan gods were symbols of the various aspects of the one true God. The pagan gods were symbols of the various aspects of the one true God. The man also asked him, as he is over 5000 years old, if he knows anything about how the universe was created 10,000 years ago. Allah mistake you responds that no one during his time entertained the fantasy that the universe was ever created, but that it always existed. Although some believed that humans were created by spontaneous generation. This begins a debate among the men. The modern men attempt to prove that the Egyptians were inferior, while Allah mistake you attempts to defend his people. The narrator asks Allah mistake you a series of questions. Allah mistake you answers them all, while one of the men begged the narrator to consult Ptolemy, Plutarch, and Diodorus Siculus as he asked the questions. At this point, the doctor comes in and asks Allah mistake you to consider modern architecture. The doctor asks Allah mistake you to consider Bowling Green Fountain in New York and Capitol at Washington, D.C., as they are prime examples of modern architectural marvels. Alamistechio then tells the men of an inferior palace in Karnak he would not pretend to assert that even 50 or 60 of the doctor's capitals might have been built within these walls, but he was by no means sure that 2 or 300 of them might not have been squeezed in with some trouble. The narrator then asks Alamistechio what he thinks about railroads. He replies that they are ill conceived and replies that the iron causeways Egyptians used for building were more than effective. He then told Alamistechio about the benefits of steel use, to which he replied that the copper tools the Egyptians used were better. The narrator then criticizes Alamistechio on his ignorance of steam. The same man that interrupted him before chastises him again and calls him a fool, telling him that the steam engine was based on a design by Heron. The doctor comes to the rescue, asking Alamistechio if ancient Egyptians had ever produced foreigners lozenges or Brandreth pills. To this, Alamistechio had to accept defeat, and in triumph, the men dispersed. The story ends with the narrator sitting at home finishing his story. In the last lines, he writes of his dissatisfaction with his life, who he calls a shrew, and with the time in general. He plans on eating his breakfast and going back to Ponnoners to get embalmed for a few centuries. So, this is a kind of science fiction, and here the narrator is going to tell us about how they dissected the mummy and how the mummy reacted when the electricity was supplied to them. It's very interesting story, dear students. Keep enjoying it.